From the Folger Shakespeare Library, this is Shakespeare Unlimited. I'm Farah Kareem Cooper, the Folger director. Our world is full of monsters. One glance at the news or at Netflix will tell you that. But what do we mean when we say someone is a monster? That they've behaved in a way that crosses some uncrossable line? Or is it possible that when we call someone a monster, we're only ever really talking about ourselves? The historian of science, Surekha Davies, has written a history of the world, told through the lens of monsters. In her new book, Humans, A Monstrous History, monsters defy the categories humans construct to order society. For Davies, monsters are full of revolutionary potential. Davies's previous book was Renaissance Ethnography and the Invention of the Human, New Worlds, Maps, and Monsters. Perhaps you're sensing a theme. Davies was a Folger Long-Term Fellow from 2017 to 2018. Here's Surekha Davies in conversation with Barbara Bogave.
Well, you've written about monsters before, so what prompted you to write another book tackling all of human history?
Well, I didn't initially imagine it was going to be a book about monsters, but I had taught an upper-level monsters course that my kind of students loved, going from antiquity to about 1800. So I'd done a whole pile of homework on this subject already. But in a way, there's an ancient story to why I'm writing about monsters, and it is that I spent my childhood just watching Star Trek and wanting to meet Martians, and that sense of wonder when you realize that the world has beings that you could not have imagined. Trying to capture that space is one reason I became a historian of exploration and wrote that first book about how exploring the Americas and traveling far changed how people in Europe thought about the category of the human. But there was actually a Washington, D.C. and kind of Folger Library impetus to some of this book, the fact that it is so ambitious and speaks not only to people interested in history, but also people interested in science, in public policy and sci-fi and fantasy, is, while I was finishing that last book, I was on fellowship at the Library of Congress and then later at the Folger Library. And at the Library of Congress, I stumbled into a conference on astrobiology. And astrobiology is the study of the possibility of life on other planets, in other galaxies, and of how we might deal with finding life like that. And this conference was called Preparing for Discovery. And in one of these panels, the scientists were giving papers about what to do about hostile aliens. And all they could talk about was weapons. And I thought they were really missing something. So I put up my hand in a question and answer session and said, well, look, shouldn't preparing for discovery include preparing societies for the shock of learning that there are extraterrestrials? Maybe people's religious beliefs will be shaken, people might panic, there might be looting, and we might need to work together to deal with some extraordinary pathogen, when we might also need to have much better communication skills so that these moments of first contact don't turn out to be complete disasters. And, people were nodding in the audience, but then the chair just cut me off and said, that's the wrong question.
Let's get back to basics, which is, what do you mean by a monster? What are we really talking about?
Well, I like to say that there are no monsters, but all of them are real. And what I mean by that is monster is a word that is within it holds stories. It's a story about who or what counts as normal and where the boundary is between different kinds of beings. So any classificatory system that has, discrete beings like, let's say, humans and wolves, if they're separate, then anything that transcends that boundary, like a werewolf, is by definition a monster, a category breaker. So the simplest explanation for the word monster is simply category breaker. So it's a being that kind of gets invented out of definitions of what things are. So in my book, Humans: A Monstrous History, I take readers through three kinds of monsters that are defined when people define three kinds of boundaries. And one of those boundaries is the boundary between types of thing. So where does human end and animal begin? Or God or machine? And so as you define gods and machines and animals and people, any beings that seem to kind of live right on the edge or straddle two categories, like the Minotaur, half bull, half person, those would count as category breakers or monsters. Then the second kind of boundary I deal with is the boundaries between social groups to whom a society might give different rights and privileges. So where's the boundary between men and women? Where's the boundary between enslaved Africans and, say, free white people? In the age of Atlantic slavery, that was a particular point at which something that existed on a continuum, which was from, African to white person, because there were people of mixed heritage. In order to create a separation between white and black, laws were written to say these were different kinds of beings with different rights, and laws were invented to say that children who were half black and half white were actually black. And kind of finally, the third type of boundary I look at is how monsters are stories told to define the parameters of normal for a single human individual. So what shape is, quote unquote, normal for a human in terms of, the number of limbs or how tall or short they are, and words like giant, freak, prodigy, dwarf, they're all words that show that people tell stories about what counts as normal for an individual human in terms of body or behavior. So this whole range of types of so-called monster is that they're all stories that define what normal means, what typical means, and what a whole lot of categories mean.
Yeah, and you sum up that kind of your definition with a really interesting phrase: monsters are ideas that show us things. And you take your examination back to the Greeks and Romans, who identified two broad categories of monsters that you've mentioned. One was monstrous births, and the other is distant peoples who they monstrified. And now I get to say Pliny the Elder, which is always my favorite thing to say.
Oh, hooray!
Pliny the Elder apparently contributed a lot to the idea that ecology or extreme environments crafted monsters.
So Pliny the Elder was this naturalist who lived 2,000 years ago, and he wrote this multi-volume treatise called The Natural History, which was influential for about, at least 1,500 years. And one of the ideas of ancient Greece and the Near East about human bodies was that they were ultimately malleable. They contained 4 fundamental substances, the humors. And so these humors were affected by the climate, by what you ate, and even to an extent, how you chose to live. And this kind of theory among naturalists like Pliny was that in distant regions where the climate was very harsh, especially very cold or very hot, your humors would be deformed so much that you would become a monstrous person. Or rather, there were in these distant places entire communities who were, quote unquote, monstrous. And they were kind of monstrous nations, monstrous species. But the thing is, it's all very well to say monstrous peoples live in places where the climate is horrible. But if you also understand human bodies to be malleable, then theoretically, if people travel far enough, they or their descendants would become monstrified. Where was the boundary between human space and monster space? There kind of wasn't one.
Very gray. That makes people anxious. And then you describe how Christians come along and the primary identification and social hierarchy shifted to faith, to what you believe. If you didn't convert, you were a barbarian and less than human.
Exactly. So what barbarian meant in Western Christendom was slightly different from what it meant in ancient Greece. For the ancient Greeks, barbarians were people who couldn't speak Greek. For the Christians, barbarians, and really the uncivil, were people who weren't of Christian faith and who refused to convert. And one of the reasons this was so important was that Christianity had introduced this sense of the kind of human being, the ultimate type of living being, separate from, the rest of life on earth, which existed more or less for humans to use. But the definition of a human was a being that was mortal and had the capacity to reason. And if you were a mortal who had the capacity to reason, your soul could go to heaven if you became Christian. But of course, you can't see what someone's soul is, and you can't really see what someone's faith is. And therein lies the anxiety about whether people of other faiths were capable of reason and what it meant if they were choosing not to convert.
Right, or if they converted, as an extension of this thinking, medieval European Christians, you write, believed that skin color or race changed, was malleable, that faith turns you white.
Yes, there are some very kind of strange stories from the late Middle Ages about how, for example, some Muslims saw pieces of the true cross. They started off with deformed kind of faces and bodies, and once they saw the true cross and converted, they became white and their shapes became fully human. There was a lot of anxiety around converted people, however, in the late 15th century and 16th century in Spain. And, half of Spain had been Muslim for something like 700 years. And then in the late 15th century, the Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand drove Muslims out of southern Spain using military force. And they forced Jews and Muslims to either convert to Christianity or to leave Spain. And, a number of people converted, others sort of converted, but, kept up some of their earlier practices. And this did not make the kind of traditional Catholics happy either, the traditional Christians. And they came up with this label of kind of new Christians to mean people whose ancestors had been Muslims or Jewish, because Christian Spaniards feared that something in the blood had passed down through the generations, transmitting the moral failings of Jews and Muslims through to their children. And so they, new Christians had different laws applied to them, different privileges. They were in the 16th century banned from traveling to the Americas because there was a fear that their dodgy beliefs would compromise Spanish missionary efforts. And, that challenge of managing faith was that it was ultimately invisible. And some of the ways in which Christians, certainly in medieval England, in Spain, tried to deal with that was by creating stereotypes about physical features so you could try and identify who was Jewish, for example, or forcing people to wear stars or live in certain areas or restricting what kinds of clothing they could wear, again, to sort of pretend and try and create distinct categories of Christian over here and people who are not Christian over there and not have a continuum.
Right, and you feel all of this tension between surface appearance and essence that later crops up in so many of Shakespeare's plays and writings. Now let's get to Shakespeare, because you write that well into Shakespeare's time, these classical beliefs about monsters and how the extreme environments cause monstrous changes, they can all be seen in theories, as you said, about the humors and also foreign cultures that in the melting pot of London of Shakespeare's day. And the Reformation comes along in the 16th century, and it also sprouts fears, you write, about all sorts of monsters.
Well, Shakespeare lived, a good 75 years, and if we look at the maybe the 150 years around his life, from the early 16th century to the mid 17th century, all kinds of things change for people in Europe that are all about monsters. And so to understand the era in which Shakespeare lived and to understand how the things that happened in that era continued to shape the world we live in today means understanding the history of monsters and monster making. And maybe I'll give you maybe 3 or 4 kind of examples quickly. One is about what happened in the age of European exploration, ships sailing great distances, sailing to the equator, circumnavigating the earth, and thus sewing together kind of human space and monster space.
Right, and all sorts of fear about the races mixing and English becoming they're colonizers, but becoming changed by the colonies and the cultures there, and intermarrying, all of that. And we see that in Shakespeare's, particularly in The Tempest.
Yeah,
and you talk about that in terms of Caliban in the Tempest, Shakespeare's most famous so-called monster, born of a witch and a devil.
Yeah, I mean, just in The Tempest, just in the character of Caliban, even there are so many. He's the monster version of the everything bagel. He really is an everything monster. So first of all, who are his parents? You've got a witch. So a witch was a person who gave their loyalty to the devil instead of to God, and received extra powers in exchange. So he was born of a witch and the devil. So, oh my God, so that human-demon line has been crossed. So in terms of substance, Caliban is already a monster. Then he was supposedly born under the influence of the moon. So remember, with humoral theory, not just climate, but actually even astrological phenomena could shape a body. He supposedly couldn't speak properly until Miranda taught him how to speak. Caliban's very name is an anagram or a remix of cannibal, and this was a new word in European languages around the year 1500 and onwards. There was a people in the Caribbean islands called the Caniba or the Canaima who supposedly consumed human flesh, and as early as 1503, the kind of Iberian kingdoms start to kind of write laws to single out these so-called cannibales and to justify war against them in order to save their future victims. So that word cannibal, if you applied it to a tribe, that effectively justified your taking away their lands. So Caliban, to return to The Tempest, Caliban's very name seems to justify, what happened to him. This human magician, Prospero, who was shipwrecked on this island with his daughter Miranda, had kind of imprisoned Caliban.
And he also fears that if Miranda and Caliban got together, they'd spawn a tribe of monsters, right?
Exactly.
They would people this isle with Calibans.
People this isle with Calibans. So Caliban boasts of this, Miranda, so if Miranda and Caliban could have fertile children, that would again dissolve the boundary between kind of human and monster, since Caliban has already been framed as monstrified. He's, partly descended from the devil. And you see that process of monstrification here very, very clearly. What it is pathologizing or excluding an individual or a group of beings in order to create separate categories where there aren't any, or separate categories where you fear there aren't any. Today, if we don't really care that we're descended from apes or from Neanderthals, then we don't really mind if there's no boundary between human and animal. But if you do mind, if it's significant for how you understand yourself or the future of your soul, that it's clear where human ends and animal begins, some kind of place in the continuum, you need to break that apart.
Yeah, and I imagine you reread The Tempest while you were writing this book. Is that right?
I did indeed.
Yeah, so what struck you most looking at it afresh through this lens of monster making, either about Caliban or whether Shakespeare shows more humanity in his treatment of this character than perhaps other writers of the period show characters of different ethnicity or race?
Caliban does get to speak for himself. He boasts that he might have peopled this isle with Caliban. So he is not afraid to say that he too has agency. He points out that this island, it was, in his view, his own, and that he was pushed from it. So you could say this is something, accidentally or intentionally, Shakespeare is offering a post-colonial critique. So someone who lost his island is saying that he has been dispossessed and that this is unacceptable according to his laws. Now,
But he has rights as a human being, as we understand it.
He has
Indigenous
rights.
yeah.
Yeah.
And for all these reasons, you describe Shakespeare's time as an inflection point in the history of monster
Yes.
making, and how, and this isn't maybe another side note, but it's just so interesting how these ideas are lost and then resurface. For instance, you describe how ancient ideas about monsters from Aristotle were partly forgotten in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, but then in this time of turning back to the classics and of great social churn and anxiety, they resurfaced and this is back in the 13th century in medieval England. And now in Shakespeare's time, it pops up again in terms of a lot of anxiety about women and gender and sex and folklore about if a pregnant woman sees a monster or even has an evil thought, she'll give birth to a monster. That had a resurgence in the medieval era that just persisted right up until the Enlightenment. And you called this fear of monstrous births an obsession in Shakespeare's time in 16th and 17th century England, and almost a meme.
Yes, it is. So, I mean, I think the 16th century is by far the most significant century for understanding the last 2,000 years of human history and where we are today. So you have this perfect storm, the age of exploration and that existential crisis about space and monsters. Then you have the era of religious reformation in the early 16th century, and suddenly you have, the witch hunt, you have polemical pamphlets that are reading individual monstrous births, like, say, calves with two heads, are being read as signs that God is unhappy with either the established church or the Protestants, depending on what side you're on. But of course, those monstrous births also have, something profound to do with gender and with women, because that practice of generation, of fetus being created and growing and then being born was something that was pretty mysterious. Nobody had any idea what the hell went on until, a child was born, and then they may or may not have the standard number of limbs. They may not be born and live very long. And there were fears about what might bring that about. And one powerful interpretation of monstrous births was that the imagination of a woman was powerful enough to change the shape of a fetus. So if you were pregnant and saw something frightening, that being might imprint on the fetus. And there was one manservant who assembled a monster compendium around the year 1700.
Samuel Pepys' manservant.
Samuel Pepys' manservant, no less, a James Paris du Plessis.
A monster scrapbook.
He had a monster scrapbook that you can go and see in the British Library. And, not only did James Paris du Plessis accidentally, supposedly, dig up a monstrous birth in his own family garden when he was a child, but his own mother-in-law supposedly saw a lobster in a market in London and ended up giving birth to a monster child. But, this is also an era in which you couldn't test paternity. And indeed, until the era of genetic testing, you couldn't be sure who the father of a child was. And yet titles, aristocratic titles, was passed down through the male line. Property would pass down through the male line. And so you needed to tell stories about who the father was and then deal with what to do if the child looked very different from the father. So the fact that you couldn't control what happened inside a woman, or maybe even everything they did, was something that became tied up with monsters. And of course, the great monarch of Shakespeare's time, Elizabeth I, was uncommon in some ways in that the quote-unquote normal way of behaving for a noble woman or a queen was to simply be in the background and have children, especially male children, who could then inherit property and inherit titles. Elizabeth I, of course, became the queen regnant. She was a queen who ruled as monarch and didn't have a husband. So she was, kind of behaving out of character.
I'm going to ask the big question now, which is, do you see us now at a similar hinge point to Shakespeare's time in the history of monster making because of the rise of AI and space exploration and conflicts over gender fluidity and multiculturalism? And do you see these ancient ideas about faith in modern-day biases?
There are, so many new forms of monster making going on right now. And we're certainly seeing old stories of monster making being repurposed today, age-old fears about people of different faiths somehow maybe not being, quote-unquote, legitimate, full, trustworthy citizens. The idea of kind of women and women's bodies needing control, that is a very ancient story. But the thing is, monster making is a very hungry and contagious practice. Once the kind of monster making rhetoric is out there, it just eats, one group after another. And I think it's important.
Well, it goes right to our lizard brain, doesn't it? I mean, this is atavistic behavior.
That activating of the lizard brain, the way certainly people who are agitating to monstrify groups are trying to kind of reach into our brains and turn off the empathy button to make it okay to give human beings, just like them, to make it okay to not treat them like human. And you mentioned kind of AI and tech. By deciding what tech is for, people are redefining what humans are. I ran into someone who thought it would be great that people were starting to get tech, machines to write poetry. This was 5 years ago. And I said, well, why do you think that would be a good idea? He said, well, it would be great for machines to write poetry because then we won't have to. But then he could have missed the point on multiple levels. People want to figure out what's in their own minds. They want to figure out what they think about things. And they want to grow by actually stretching their own brains. And you don't do that if you ask a machine to write poetry. And I said to him, well, if robots are writing poetry, what would we do instead? And he said, we could watch movies. And, it's not an either or. I write things and I watch movies. But, this is like saying, oh, I want to be an Olympic athlete. I'm just going to put some DVDs on of Olympians training, and that's going to make my muscles stronger. Well,
while the cyborg wins the races for me.
While the cyborg wins the races for me, well, then
the
you
android.
Didn't.
Yeah.
But the experience of being a kind of sentient being of like whatever species is of experiencing what your mind and body can do, not what some machine can do. And there's a very dangerous story. I think this is especially dangerous for, say, kids who are still in school or just entering college. It's a story about what humans can do not being enough. Those models suck up content that is somebody else's intellectual property that was fed in there without asking anyone. So right from the start, the way the creative industry tech has been developed into so-called AI is so fundamentally dehumanizing as to basically be telling stories about how anybody made of flesh and blood is actually not necessary and should be thrown out of an airlock.
You write about, towards the end, monstro-futurism, or a monster-centered ethics. So what would that look like in this age? What do we need to honor humanity in the age of the android and the cyborg and AI and this technology you've been talking about?
For a start, monster doesn't have to mean something bad. I mean, if it's just a category breaker, and if we decide that, oh, well, categories are so yesterday, and we want to explore what it means to be human in a peaceful fashion in every shape and form, and remember that each one of us is unique. If each one of us is wondrous, then nobody is a monster per se. And monstro-futurism is this word that I dreamt up, really inspired by the arts and literature movement known as kind of Afrofuturism. And sci-fi and fantasy contains a lot of models for better ways for people to interact with each other, and these are whereas the tech bros seem to take away exactly the wrong messages, and you wonder how much attention they actually paid to Star Trek, if they really did watch it or merely pretending that they did. But only by embracing all of the possibilities of being human that we see around us, that we can actually fully give ourselves permission to be every version of ourselves. By recognizing the humanity of others, we don't give away our own rights and freedoms.
Or power.
And we don't dehumanize ourselves. In fact, we demonstrate our humanity by recognizing it in others.
Oh, I could talk to you forever, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to say goodbye. Thank you so much for the book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That was Surekha Davies, interviewed by Barbara Bogave. Humans, A Monstrous History is out now from the University of California Press. This episode was produced by Matt Frasica. Garland Scott is the executive producer. It was edited by Gail Kern-Pastor. We had technical help from Nat Hardy in Boston and Voice Tracks West in Studio City, California. Our web producer is Paula Garcia Acuna. Leonor Fernandez edits our transcripts. Final mixing services provided by Clean Cuts at 3Cs Inc. If you're a fan of Shakespeare Unlimited, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. While you're there, be sure to hit follow so you get new episodes as soon as they come out. Shakespeare Unlimited comes to you from the Folger Shakespeare Library. Home to the world's largest Shakespeare collection, the Folger is dedicated to advancing knowledge and the arts. The Folger campus on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. is open to the public. Come explore our new exhibition halls or watch a performance in our theater. For more information, visit our website, folger.edu. Until next time, thanks for listening.